I stood there in my cap and gown, holding my diploma, completely alone. 5 years later, I walked the red carpet, and suddenly, everyone who forgot me was cheering my name. This is what happens when you turn silence into power. Success doesn't always start with applause. Sometimes it begins in empty rooms. I worked for years, staying up late, skipping parties, sacrificing normal experiences just to hear my family say, "We're proud of you." But on graduation day, no one showed up. No calls, no texts, just excuses. That moment could have broken me. Instead, it became the fuel for everything that came next. Because when no one believes in you, you have two choices: disappear or prove them wrong. If you ever felt overlooked, smash the like button, because this story is for you. And subscribe if you know what it's like to turn pain into purpose. Being invisible to the people who were supposed to see you first. The childhood pattern. From the very beginning, I was a quiet one, the kid who faded into the background while others got applause. Family gatherings were like award shows where I wasn't even nominated. My cousins got standing ovations for their soccer goals or straight-A report cards, but when I showed them the stories I wrote, the reaction was always the same: a pat on the head, a half-hearted "that's cute, sweetie," before the conversation shifted back to someone else's achievements. It wasn't just indifference. It was like they didn't even see the effort. I'd spend weeks crafting little books, binding them with tape, dreaming of the day someone would finally say, "This is amazing." But the closest I ever got was my mom tucking one into a drawer like a forgotten receipt. School wasn't much better. Teachers called me shy, when really, I just learned early that speaking up didn't change anything. Classmates remember me as the girl who sat in the back, scribbling in notebooks, invisible unless someone needed homework answers. Even then, it was transactional. No real friendship, just temporary usefulness. Birthdays were the worst. Relatives would RSVP, then no-show, leaving me blowing out candles alone while my parents made excuses. They're just busy. Busy felt like code for "you're not worth the time." The weirdest part? I didn't even resent them. I just assumed this was how things worked. Some people were meant to be celebrated, and others were meant to watch. It wasn't until high school, when a teacher pulled me aside after class and said, "You have a voice," stop waiting for permission to use it, that I realized being overlooked wasn't my fate. It was their failure to look. But that realization came later. Back then, I just kept writing, not for them, but for the version of me who might one day be heard. The graduation betrayal. I started planning my graduation day like it was a royal coronation, because after years of being overlooked, this was finally going to be my moment. I mailed out fancy invitations 2 months early, even hand-delivered some to family members who always forget to check their mail. My mother promised she'd be there. My dad said he wouldn't miss it for the world, and my aunts all gushed about how proud they were, in those casual conversations that somehow never translated into actual support. The morning of, I put on my cap and gown like armor, practicing my smile in the mirror. This was going to be the day everything changed. But as I lined up with my classmates, my phone stayed eerily silent. No "good luck" texts. No "we're running late" messages. Just nothing. When we marched in the auditorium, my eyes scanned the crowd desperately, but those reserved seats sat empty. The worst part wasn't the absence itself. It was the avalanche of pathetic excuses that trickled in afterwards. My father, who lived 10 minutes away, blamed traffic. My mother had forgotten about a dentist appointment. My brother didn't realize it was such a big deal. As I sat alone in my dorm room holding my diploma that night, I realized this wasn't just about them missing an event. It was proof that after 22 years, I still wasn't important enough to remember. The graduation photos my classmates posted that night were full of beaming families and bouquets of flowers, while mine was just me, a folding chair, and the crushing understanding that even my biggest achievements would never be enough to make them care. That empty auditorium taught me more about my family than any holiday dinner ever had. Their love came with conditions I could never meet, and their support only existed when it was convenient for them. It was the day I stopped expecting them to show up for me and started showing up for myself. The silence after. The weeks following graduation were filled with a quiet, so heavy it felt like physical weight. Phone calls that never came, text messages left unanswered, family gatherings where my achievement was conspicuously absent from conversation. They didn't apologize. They simply pretended nothing had happened, as if my graduation was some insignificant detail they'd all collectively agreed to erase. Thanksgiving arrived like an awkward family reunion, where everyone carefully avoided the elephant in the room, talking about weather and recipes while my diploma collected dust in its holder. What hurt most wasn't their absence on the day itself, but their refusal to acknowledge how deeply it had cut me. My mother would casually ask about job prospects without mentioning the ceremony she'd missed. My father discussed my student loans while ignoring the empty seat that should have been his. The message was clear. My milestones didn't deserve recognition. My pain wasn't worth addressing. I watched cousins get celebrated for far lesser accomplishments, community college certificates, minor promotions, while my university degree went unremarked upon. The silence became a living thing between us, growing thicker with each passing month, until I realized this wasn't just forgetfulness. It was a pattern of dismissal so ingrained they didn't even see it anymore. Christmas photos showed everyone smiling together while I stood slightly apart, the invisible wound still fresh. When I finally worked up the courage to mention how much their absence had hurt me, the responses ranged from defensive excuses to outright gaslighting. You're too sensitive. It wasn't that important. We'll celebrate next time. There would never be a next time. That silence taught me everything I needed to know about where I stood in their lives, and more importantly, where they would stand in mine moving forward. The crushing disappointment slowly hardened into something else, a cold determination to build a life where my worth wasn't determined by people who couldn't see it. Their silence became my answer, and in that answer, I found my freedom, the first pivot. The moment I realized waiting for their validation was like begging for scraps at a banquet I'd never be invited to. Something inside me snapped. With $837 in my bank account and a duffel bag of secondhand clothes, I bought a one-way ticket to Los Angeles. Not because I was brave, but because staying had become unbearable. That first month was a blur of couch surfing and survival jobs, answering phones at a talent agency by day, bartending at a dive in Echo Park by night. I'd sneak onto studio lots with borrowed crew badges, lingering near sets just to absorb the electricity of real filmmaking. Every rejection stung, but less than the memory of those empty graduation seats. I memorized scripts in bathroom stalls during breaks, wrote scenes on napkins during graveyard shifts, turned my tiny rented closet into a writing cave plastered with index cards in desperation. What kept me going wasn't confidence, but the bone-deep certainty that I had nothing left to lose. The turning point came when I volunteered as a PA on a student film, 14-hour days for no pay, just to be near cameras. When the director trashed the original script days before shooting, I slid my rear right under his door at 3 a.m. He called it raw but promising, and suddenly I wasn't just a coffee girl anymore. That minuscule crack of opportunity became my lifeline. I stopped calling home, stopped expecting cheers from the sidelines. The hunger that grew in me wasn't for fame, but for proof that the girl they'd ignored could build something they couldn't look away from. Every no became fuel. Every small yes a victory they couldn't take credit for. I was done being an afterthought in someone else's story. This time, I would be the author, the mentor. Recognition came unexpectedly from someone who owed me nothing, a veteran director known for his brutal honesty who noticed me lingering near craft services with a notebook full of script notes. He snatched it from my hands during lunch, flipping pages with a frown that slowly softened into curiosity. "You see the spaces between lines," he muttered, pointing at my margin notes about a character's unspoken motivations. That single observation shattered something in me. After years of being told my perspective didn't matter, here was someone who not only noticed but valued how I processed stories. He became my unlikely champion, inviting me to shadow him on set despite my lack of credentials, tearing apart my writing with precision that stung but ultimately healed. "Stop writing what you think they want," he'd growl. "The world doesn't need more polite, forgettable stories." His office became my classroom, filled with dog-eared screenplays and war stories from decades in the industry. What he taught me wasn't just craft, but courage, the audacity to believe my voice deserved space. When I confessed about my family's absence at graduation, he didn't offer pity. "Good," he said. "Now you know whose approval you don't need." He pushed me to channel that loneliness into my work, to mine my anger and disappointment for authentic emotion rather than dulling its edges. Under his guidance, my writing transformed from imitation to something raw and uncomfortably personal. The day he handed my script to a producer with "Read this, she's got the real thing" scribbled on the cover was the first time I understood what validation truly felt like. Not the hollow praise of obligation, but earned respect from someone who demanded excellence. He didn't care about my pedigree or connections, only the work itself. In a town obsessed with who you know, he taught me the more valuable lesson. It's who knows you, and more importantly, what they know you for. That gruff, uncompromising man gave me the rarest gift, not opportunity, but the belief that I deserved it. The breakthrough. The script that changed everything poured out of me in 3 sleepless nights. A raw story about a young woman who becomes invisible to those around her, literally. I channeled every moment of being overlooked into those pages, the frustration of unheard voices and uncelebrated victories. When my mentor submitted it to a small indie festival, I expected nothing. The notification came at 2:37 a.m., a jury selection for Most Original Voice. Walking into that screening, I braced for polite applause, but the audience reaction hit like a thunderclap. People lingered after to discuss the themes. Festival programmers asked about my next project, and for the first time, strangers quoted my characters back to me with genuine admiration. What shocked me most wasn't the attention, but how different it felt from the hollow praise I'd chased before. These people didn't care about obligation or family ties. They responded to the work itself. A producer cornered me at the after-party, insisted my concept deserved a feature adaptation. When the trade publications listed me as a fresh talent to watch, the industry emails started flooding in. Not because someone owed me a favor, but because the writing stood on its own. That short film, made for less than my monthly rent, became the key that unlocked doors no family connection could have opened. The validation I desperately sought from relatives for decades came effortlessly from people who'd never met me, proving a hard truth. Real recognition isn't begged for. It's earned when you stop performing for those who refuse to see you and start creating for those waiting to discover you. The script's final line became my silent manifesto. The moment she stopped waiting to be seen was when everyone finally looked up. The phone calls. The voicemail started appearing like clockwork the day after the festival write-up hit industry trades. Relatives I hadn't heard from in years suddenly remembered how to dial my number. Their messages dripping with a forced casualness that couldn't mask their calculated interest. "Just calling to catch up," chirped the aunt who'd missed every birthday after I turned 12. "Heard you're doing something creative now," asked the uncle who'd mocked my writing ambitions at Thanksgiving dinners. The tone was always the same, faux innocence undercut by poorly concealed opportunism, as if we'd simply lost touch rather than them systematically ignoring my existence until I became noteworthy. Family group chats I'd been excluded from suddenly included me with exaggerated enthusiasm, flooded with nostalgic photos carefully curated to suggest we'd always been close. Cousins who'd never liked my posts in a decade of social media activity became my most ardent commenters overnight, their sudden engagement as transparent as it was pathetic. The most brazen was a second cousin twice removed sliding into my DMs with a script idea that just needs your industry connections. What fascinated me wasn't their audacity, but their complete lack of shame, as if years of neglect could be erased with a single congratulatory text. I saved every message without replying, compiling them like evidence in some invisible trial. These weren't reconciliations. They were land grabs disguised as affection, attempt to claim some reflected glory from success they'd done nothing to support. Their sudden interest confirmed what I'd always suspected. They hadn't failed to see my potential before. They'd simply refused to acknowledge it until it became too visible to ignore. The calls kept coming, but now I understood their true purpose. Not to celebrate me, but to insert themselves into a narrative they tried to write me out of for years. The premiere invites. I crafted those premiere invitations with the same meticulous attention to detail I'd once poured into my graduation announcements. Thick cardstock, embossed lettering, the works. But this time, the gesture wasn't hopeful. It was forensic. I addressed each envelope to every relative who claimed to be too busy years prior, watching their names materialize like ghosts from a past life. The RSVPs came faster than I'd anticipated. Eager confirmations from people who'd never responded to anything I'd sent before, their sudden enthusiasm laid bare in exclamation points, and wouldn't miss it, declarations. Some even included unsolicited suggestions about after-parties or photo ops, as if this was their victory to choreograph. I imagined them pressing those gilt-edged cards to their refrigerators, showing them off to friends like personal achievements rather than belated apologies. What fascinated me most was their complete lack of awareness. No acknowledgement of the painful symmetry, no hint of shame about showing up for the red carpet after skipping the struggle. They requested +1s, asked about parking validation, wondered if there'd be press interviews. Practical questions that revealed how thoroughly they'd missed the point. I said yes to everything, playing the gracious host while quietly documenting every interaction like an anthropologist studying a bizarre new species. Their willingness to celebrate the destination after ignoring the journey told me everything I needed to know. These weren't changed people making amends. They were spectators drawn to bright lights, finally willing to see me now that I stood in them. I made sure each invitation included one deliberate detail. In the corner, nearly invisible, a small embossed graduation cap. Not for them to notice, for me to remember. The red carpet. The flashbulbs erupted as I stepped onto the crimson fabric, their blinding bursts etching the moment into permanence. I wore the same shade of blue as my graduation gown, not as a tribute, but as a quiet declaration that this triumph belonged to the girl they'd abandoned years before. They materialized like eager ghosts along the barricades, dressed in borrowed finery, their cheers rising above the crowd with unnatural volume. Cameras captured their proud embraces, arms slung too tightly around my shoulders, kisses planted too forcefully on my cheeks, each gesture carefully staged for maximum visibility. I could smell the desperation beneath their expensive perfumes, see the calculation in their smiles as they angled toward photographers. "We always knew you'd make it," they proclaimed to anyone within earshot, their words dissolving into the hollow echo of all those silent graduations days. Reporters asked about my inspirations while relatives elbowed into frame, subtly experts on my creative process. Their performative pride would have shattered me years ago. Now it just rolled off like rainwater. What surprised me wasn't their presence, but my complete indifference to it. The realization that their approval no longer held any power. When the festival coordinator whispered, "Your family must be so proud," I simply nodded toward the flashing lights and said, "They certainly looked the part." The grand irony struck me as we posed for pictures. They'd come to be seen with me, not to see me, just as they'd always prioritized appearances over authenticity. Their elaborate displays of support weren't for my benefit, but for the audience they'd finally decided was worth performing for. As we moved inside, I caught my reflection in the theater doors, a woman transformed not by their attention, but by her survival of their neglect. The real victory wasn't their presence tonight, but my ability to walk past them without needing a single word they had to say. The dedication. When the microphone was thrust into my hands for post-screening remarks, the room fell silent in that way that precedes either profound truth or profound awkwardness. I could feel their expectant gazes. Industry executives waiting for polished gratitude, relatives anticipating public acknowledgement of their unwavering support. Instead, I spoke to a version of myself still sitting alone in that empty auditorium years earlier. This is for the chairs that remained unfilled. I began, watching confused smiles freeze on certain faces in the crowd. For every dream nurtured in silence and every victory celebrated alone. The air grew thick with uncomfortable recognition as I continued, not with bitterness but with quiet precision, detailing how abandonment had become my most valuable teacher. Cameras flashed on relatives shifting in their seats as I thanked the people who showed me what not to become, and the absence that made presence unnecessary. Journalists scribbled furiously. This wasn't the usual saccharine dedication they expected. By the time I reached the final line, some people will only recognize your light when it's bright enough to illuminate them too. The applause came first from strangers in the back rows, then spread like wildfire while my family clapped with mechanical politeness. Backstage, publicists murmured about controversial remarks while producers called it brilliant branding. But the most meaningful reaction came from a young crew member who slipped me a note. "Today, you filled the seat for someone like me." In that moment, I understood the true power of the spotlight. not to force those who hurt you to see your worth, but to become the beacon for others still finding theirs. The people who miss your beginnings don't get to dictate your endings. That's what the empty chairs taught me, and that's why I keep one vacant seat at every premiere now. Not as a monument to their absence, but as a reminder that some spaces are better left unfilled. Post-premiere dinner, my aunt tearfully said, "We always believed in you." I handed her my graduation photo. "Then where were you?" The table went silent. Life's greatest revenge isn't anger. It's outgrowing the boxes people put you in. That empty graduation aisle taught me more than any diploma. Some people only show up for the spotlight, not the struggle. But here's the secret. When you stop needing their approval, you become unstoppable. My movie wasn't for them. It was for the girl who sat alone, wondering if she mattered. To anyone feeling invisible right now, your worth isn't decided by who claps for you. It's built in the quiet hours when you choose yourself. Success isn't about filling seats. It's about no longer needing to. If this hit home, like and subscribe. Your story's just getting started, and I'll be here for the next chapter. The world notices you fastest when you stop waiting for permission to shine.